Over the past couple of years, I've read and summarized over 100 plus books on this YouTube channel. And you can see all of those books inside of this AI like web. I've got over 100 different books and 600 different ideas inside of this software. And that was not the hardest part. The most difficult part of all of this was certainly the consistency that it takes to read over 100 different books over the past couple of years. It's about a book a week and sometimes a little bit more than that. One thing about that is that all the speed reading techniques in the world aren't going to help you if you don't have a dedicated habit of reading. One of the things that I get asked the most often on this YouTube channel is, how do I build a reading habit? How do I start to read a book a week, similar to what you've done? And honestly, I'm going to talk about that inside this video, but there's something else that I wanted to point out before we even get started. And that's that the reading habit is really just one small part of the equation. One of the main things that reading those 100 books taught me is that knowledge ends up being absolutely nothing without having action. If I read a book and I don't get anything from it, did I really read the book at all? That's something we're going to be exploring a little bit more in depth here today. But these 5 things that I'm going to go through today are things that I learned about habits. And I think they're going to help you spend more time reading and build up that reading habit that so many of you are looking to build. But also, they're going to allow you to put the knowledge that you gain into action once you're finished. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on a lot today. If you're interested in getting direct access to this tool with the 100 plus book summaries to kind of 80-20 your learning time, I've pulled out the most important points from 100 different books to save you a lot of reading time. If you're interested in taking part in that, you can click the first link down below in the description. And with that, let's get directly into the video. The first point that I wanted to talk about here today is this idea of the power of compounding. And this is coming up in multiple different books that we've reviewed on the channel, but Darren Hardy is probably the one that I wanted to talk about the most. He says inside of the compound effect that the essence here is that small daily actions lead to big results over time. And if you've ever seen the kind of graph of exponential growth that goes along with the compound effect, it's really impactful. You can think of this equation. Small actions plus time equals big results. So that's what we're thinking about with the compound effect. So even small daily habits can lead into big things in your life, accomplishing big goals or having success in certain areas. And that's something that I think we all kind of know intuitively. But one thing that James Clear points out inside his book, Atomic Habits, is that while that's an important part of the success that habits can help us with, it can be really hard to see that happening in real time. He calls this the plateau of latent potential, and that's really what I wanted to touch on. It's something that we should be very wary of along the journey. When you first start reading a couple of pages a day, for example, it doesn't feel like you're getting that far, 10 pages a day or something like that. It feels like a small kind of drop in the bucket as far as what you actually want to accomplish. Those 10 pages really start to add up. So we need to push through this plateau of latent potential in order to take part in the compounding process. James says that if you find yourself struggling to build a good habit or to break a bad one, it's not because you've lost your ability to improve, but it's often because you've not yet crossed the plateau of latent potential. Complaining about not achieving success despite working hard is kind of like complaining about an ice cube not melting when you heated it from 25 to 31 degrees. Your work was not wasted. It was just being stored, right? Ice is going to melt at 32 degrees is something that he points out here as well. All the action is going to happen at that 32 degrees. When you finally break through that plateau of latent potential, people will call it an overnight success. And of course, we see that all the time. He says that mastery requires practice. It's very, very important. Mastery requires practice. And one thing that I see all too often is that we set goals like, I want to lose X weight by Y time. And setting a goal like this ends up being a recipe for failure. Because when we set goals like this, results don't show up by that day and that time. We stop doing the little things that would have led to that success, and instead we try to default to doing it all in 1 month or the 1 week before our goal ends up happening. Remember the power of compounding. It's the hallmark of any compounding process that the most powerful outcomes end up being delayed. And you can think of the analogy of the stone cutter, right? They're making a ton of small kind of hits, small hits, small hits, small hits on this big stone. And what ends up happening, of course, is that the final hit looks like it did all of the work, but really it was all those small hits on the way. So we need to keep the power of compounding in the front of our mind, but I feel like that is something that a lot of people know about. All the results happen at the end of the compound process. But the plateau of latent potential, where it can feel like things aren't happening, that's what we need to be wary of when we're pushing through the first couple of weeks, couple of months of building up a new habit. The next point here that I wanted to talk about is just like how behaviors happen, how habits are made. And this is coming from BJ Fogg, who is a PhD and a researcher on habits, wrote a really good book, Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg. Really recommend that you check it out if you haven't already. I've got a video here on the channel. But one of the best ideas that I took away from this book was his behavior model and how we can use it to make our own habits stick a little bit easier. So this idea of B equals MAP, the whole idea of this is that behavior happens when our motivation, ability, and prompt converge at the same time. So what you'll notice here is that this doesn't say habits happen when motivation, ability, and prompt converge at the same time. But this is all behavior. The behaviors that you're currently having, the behaviors that you're currently doing are following this, just like the behaviors that you want to be doing. So let's dive into this a little bit deeper. Step one in behavior change is understanding how behavior happens. This means that we can take the pressure off ourselves. It's not our willpower, it's not our character, it's not our discipline that determines whether we're having good habits or not. But behaviors happen for a reason, and it's not because of a personal failure. This is something that was really hard for me to kind of reconcile when I was essentially first getting started in this realm of personal development. So you can see that behaviors happen because our motivation, our ability, and a prompt converge at the same time. A motivation is our desire to do the behavior. Ability is our capacity or our ability to do the behavior. The prompt is a cue to get the behavior done. So let's look into a behavior that you want to change, potentially. And I recommend that maybe you grab a piece of paper, take a note-taking app out. What's a behavior that you want to change? First, what's the behavior, right? What's the behavior? Is it a positive one? Is it a negative one? Do you want to start eating a regular breakfast? Do you want to stop eating a terrible breakfast? Either one of those, this model will work for. Let's look at your motivation. Where are you on the graph, essentially? Are you really motivated? Are you extremely motivated to essentially get this behavior change done? Are you kind of like, I could keep going the way that I currently am? Important to look. The next piece is looking at your current ability. Do you have the ability to cook a healthy breakfast? Do you have the ability to essentially skip breakfast if that's what you're going to do? Where are you on that graph? Finally, we're going to think about your prompts. How do you know when you're going to, I kind of built it into the question here, but obviously you're going to do this for breakfast. But is it going to be first thing when you wake up? Is it going to be an hour after you wake up? What specific time are you going to have that breakfast, and what's the prompt? Are you going to put a reminder in your phone? Are you going to know when the clock strikes 9 a.m. you're going to have your breakfast? Think about these pieces of essentially habit change, right? Because behavior happens when our motivation, ability, and prompt converge. So we need to think about each one of those in kind of essentially isolation so that we know how to improve our essentially likelihood of accomplishing the behavior that we want to do. And the next two things that we're going to talk about are actually just ways that you can actually do that, right? So the first thing that we're talking about here, as I go back and find the note here, the first thing we're thinking about is, okay, we know when behavior happens. It's when motivation, ability, and prompt converge at the same time. We're taking a look at two specific actionable items that you can do to make your habits or your daily actions more likely. The first one is something that Stephen Guise is calling stupid small inside of his book, Mini Habits, which I think is, again, worth reading if you haven't already. Another video on this channel. The first thing we're thinking about stupid small, and this is how we should be thinking of habits when we are writing them. So a mini habit is basically a much smaller version of a new habit that you want to form. 100 push-ups daily is minified into 1 push-up daily. And 3,000 words writing daily becomes 50 words writing daily. Thinking positively all the time becomes thinking 2 positive thoughts a day. Living an entrepreneurial lifestyle, for example, becomes thinking of 2 business ideas per day. The foundation of mini habits is in stupid small steps. The concept of small steps is nothing new, of course, but how and why they work have not really been adequately dissected. Of course, small steps are relative as well. A small step for you could be a giant leap for me. And that's where ability comes in. It's a sliding scale. If someone's more able to do more push-ups than you, then they are more able to start a little bit bigger. If you're less able and 1 push-up feels hard, it might be something even smaller than that. So this is playing on the ability scale here, as we talked about before. We want to make our things stupid small relative to the most you can do, and that's perfect. So what's your target habit? We talked about a few already, talking about breakfast, eating healthier, exercising, maybe it's reading more like this video is about. Reading more becomes reading 1 page a day. And if it seems like that's too small for you, that's kind of the point. The point of these mini habits is to make it so small it seems stupid. That way, on your worst day, your ability to do the thing is still going to be relatively high. You can do the least possible thing. And this is what helps you build up consistency over time. This is actually how I first got started. I would just listen to a book for 5 minutes a day in the morning. That's how I got started reading. That's one of the things that was probably the most impactful for me. And now reading a book a day, this took 5 years for me to build up that habit. So it's consistent. So that might be something for you to think about as well. What's stupid small look like for you? And how can you take the power of compounding into account when you're doing this? Remembering, of course, our plateau of latent potential, and that ability is only one piece. You've got to have the motivation to do it. You got to have a real strong purpose and why. I recommend that you check out some of my book reviews on Tom Rath, Life's Great Question, if you're interested in motivation. And then the prompt is something we'll talk about a little bit later. But this one here we're thinking about is this idea that, okay, we have shrunk the ability down to 1 push-up, 1 page. We've got it stupid small, and that's great. But another piece that I think is very important is that obstacles are going to come up. And Ryan Holiday tells us inside of his book, The Obstacle is the Way, full of Stoic wisdom, that the obstacle in the way becomes the way. And that's how I want to think about obstacles as well. If for whatever reason that day you were too busy to have breakfast, if you were too busy to do 1 push-up, I want to think about why that happened, or why, in fact, that might happen. And I think that Gabrielle Oettingen, inside of her book, Rethinking Positive Thinking, gives us just this amazing formula for planning to overcome these obstacles, meaning that our ability bar is even lower, or our ability to do things is even higher. And that formula is something that she calls WOOP. And this is a tool that I've got inside of the personal development AI as well. Now, tools are really only accessible for channel members. I don't have specific videos on each one of these things. I will go over it with you here today. But if you're interested in the dozens and dozens of tools, actionable items, checklists that I've built from the books, you can click the first link down below in the description and get access to those. This tool says that on a blank sheet of paper, name the wish that you have in 3 to 6 words. We want to identify our best outcome, and then we want to name our obstacle and write it down. And then finally, we want to create a plan. So let's go through this together. We've got our checklist. The first one is wish. So the question here is, what do you want to see in your life? What's your wish, right? That's the W of WOOP. We want to try and imagine something challenging yet doable. We want to play around with time frames. So maybe it's a year, maybe it's a quarter, a month, a day, or a week. You get to play around with that a little bit. And this is a way of setting goals that are connected directly to your habits. The next piece is outcome. What's the number one thing that you would benefit from should you achieve this wish, right? What's the number one thing that you would benefit from, or number one benefit you would see if you achieved this wish? The next piece is, okay, we've got wish, we've got outcome. That's where most people stop, right? They don't think about the things that might potentially get in your way. But we want to specifically call this out, not only so that we can be prepared, but so that we don't kind of sit back and, just sit back and not think about the things that might come up, because when they do come up, we need to be prepared. What is an obstacle that stands in your way of achieving your wish? The obstacle should come from within you. External obstacles we don't always have control over. So you might think, okay, I'm trying to eat a little bit healthier. Apathy comes in, kind of like, what does it matter at the end of the day? Loneliness, maybe it's a conditioned response that you have. Maybe it's anxiety. It's some sort of internal feeling that you have that might cause you to stray from your path. We talked about B equals MAP, but that doesn't take into account kind of the things that might be going on inside you that might cause you to get off the path and therefore not be able to take kind of the benefits of that compounding, right? We talked about how consistency compounds. We need to be very careful. We need to think about the obstacles so that we don't kind of stray from the path and lose that power of compounding. So we've got the obstacle, and now we want to think about what can we do to overcome that obstacle? What is one effective thing that you could do? And of course, we're starting small. We're starting stupid small. What's one behavior or habit you'll need to pick up to achieve your plan? What's one behavior or habit you'll need to drop to achieve your plan? So for example, this is maybe coming up with, for example, with the reading one. Our wish is to read more books, to be more well-read, for example. Maybe we want to do that in a year. In a year, we want to read 24 books. The number one benefit we'll achieve from this, potentially we're going to build a YouTube channel, right? That might be a really good way to go about it, but also we'll get smarter along the way. We'll be more well-read, and hopefully we'll be more prepared to have success in our lives. The obstacle, of course, is I don't feel like reading. I just don't feel like it that day. Maybe I'm tired from work. Maybe I have a little bit of apathy. Maybe I'd rather just kind of veg out and watch some Netflix. Those are all totally fair obstacles. The plan that we can do to overcome that obstacle is let's make this stupid small, but then also let's be prepared. What are some of the ways that you can prepare your environment in order to essentially make sure that you're going to be able to do it? Having your books at your nightstand might be a good example of that. Having your books right beside your coffee maker first thing in the morning might be a really good way to go about it. This one for me is all about planning and adapting your environment to make the habits more likely. So we've made things stupid small, and that increases our ability. But then we also need to set up our environment so that our ability can essentially even raise higher. So that's what we want to think about with Whoop. I really recommend you check out this book, Rethinking Positive Thinking. If you're thinking about setting goals, you're not sure what habits you want to build, this book will go over everything that you might need. The final piece that I want to talk about here is having the right mindset when you fail. And I use the word when, not if, because it's been said many different times in all of these books that it's not a matter of if you will fail, if you will get off track, but when you're going to get off track. The whole idea here is that building new habits is hard. They take time, and the obstacles that are in your way, sometimes you can't plan for them to come up. And that's why I think it's very important to have a growth mindset about this whole entire process and not to get stuck in a fixed mindset. Carol Dweck is going to give us a breakdown of these two mindsets to really drive this idea home and what these two different mindsets mean for success. The quote goes like this: for 20 years, my research has shown that the view you adopt for yourself profoundly affects the way you lead your life. It can determine whether you become the person that you want to be and whether you accomplish the things that you value. So how does this happen? How can a simple belief have the power to transform your psychology and as a result your life? We've got these two kind of dichotomous mindsets here. We've got the fixed mindset first, and that means that you believe that your qualities are essentially carved in stone. The fixed mindset creates an urgency to prove yourself over and over. If you only have a certain amount of intelligence, a certain personality, a certain moral character, well, then you'd better prove that you have a healthy dose of them. It simply wouldn't do good. It wouldn't do to look and feel deficient in these most basic characteristics. Growth mindset is, in this mindset, The hand that you're dealt is just the starting point for your development. The growth mindset is based on the belief that your basic qualities are things that you can cultivate through your efforts. Although people may differ in every which way in their initial talents, their aptitudes, their interests, their temperaments, everyone can change and they can grow through application and experience. So, how can one belief have so much power? Carol is explaining inside the book that a fixed mindset and a growth mindset are two very different things, and there's a few common characteristics among each group. So, I think something very important to think about here is you might think, okay, beliefs and retraining and self talk kind of gurus mostly focus on one thing. Something like, I'm really good at reading in order to overcome a limiting belief, like repeating that thing over and over and over again. But a growth mindset is kind of like a meta belief. It's kind of is layered over top of all the habits, all the behaviors, all the kind of beliefs that you have. And it's the belief that you can get better over time. And even if you fail, you can learn from that failure. It literally will change everything in your life if you can identify when you're in a growth mindset and when you're in a fixed mindset and do your best to kind of reframe into a growth mindset in many different ways. I think something important to point out here as well is that we're all in fixed and growth mindsets at different times in different places in our life. So the first piece for this entire growth mindset idea for me is just identifying where you are and where you are not. Having a growth mindset is going to allow you to push through the failures that are inevitably going to happen along your way to the compound effect. You're going to be able to push through the plateau of latent potential because you believe that you can get better. You're going to be able to learn when I didn't set my habits stupid small enough because I wasn't able to do them. You're going to know that when you come up against an obstacle and you didn't plan for that obstacle ahead of time, that you're going to be able to learn from that obstacle and you can now plan better as a result. The growth mindset is an overarching theme across a lot of these different books, but I think it's actually the thing you should start with. You got to know about the power of compounding. You got to know about the behavior model so that you can set up yourself for success. Making things stupid small and planning for the obstacles ahead of time are both very important parts of building new habits and success. But having the right mindset and knowing that you can actually change is the first and most important piece to work on. Thanks for being with me here today. Again, if you're interested in getting access to over 100 different book summaries, 600 different ideas, all organized into an AI-like piece of software that you can access on any web browser, then click the first link down below in the description. I hope to see you in the next video, and I hope you check out some of the videos that I referenced in this one. Thanks.